The year is 1814, and we're in Plattsburgh, New York. The War of 1812, fought between the British Empire and the fledgling United States of America, has been raging for 2 years, and the Americans are losing. Fought on land and sea, the Battle of Plattsburgh was brutal. The British forces, commanded by Captain George Downey in the sea and Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost on the land, consisted of 11,000 men, 1 frigate, 1 brig, 2 sloops, and 12 gunships. On the other hand, the American forces, under the sea command of Master Commandant Thomas McDonough and Brigadier General Alexander Macomb, had only 6,354 men, very precise, of which almost 1,000 were wounded. About half of them were regulars, the everyday American foot soldiers, with the others being made up of various militia groups, not the most impressive army. In other words, the Americans were outgunned, outmanned, and had the pressure of a large contingent of wounded to worry about. The outcome seemed assured, and it didn't look good for the Americans. Amid the land fighting force was a man named William Miller. Miller was a New England farmer who had spent most of the war as a lieutenant army recruiter. He was also, in case you were wondering, a deist. That is to say, he believed in God, but rejected any revelation outside of what could be determined through science and rational thought. A bit of a weird detail, but it will come up later. Early in 1814, Miller was promoted from lieutenant to captain and was transferred to the army proper with a company of men. The Battle of Plattsburgh was the first real action that he'd seen since the start of the war 2 years earlier. And even though he and his men were far away from the naval conflict, stationed in the fort, Miller and the soldiers under his command weren't spared from the carnage. Quote, "Bombs, rockets, and shrapnel shells fell as thick as hailstones," unquote, he later said. One of these shots exploded only 2 feet away from Miller, killing one of his men and injuring 3 others. Miraculously, though, Miller survived without even a scratch. Captain William Miller was haunted by this close call with death. Why did he survive where others perished? His deistic views didn't square with his lived experience. Had God saved his life? He later wrote, quote, "It seemed to me that the Supreme Being must have watched over the interests of this country in an especial manner and delivered us from the hands of our enemies. So surprising a result against such odds did seem to me like the work of a mightier power than man." End quote. By the way, the Battle of Plattsburgh ended with an American victory, an unexpected result on both sides. After the war, Miller returned home to his farming life, but he couldn't shake these newfound revelations, these troubled thoughts. They haunted his dreams. He started going to his local Baptist church, a place he had swore he'd never be part of long ago, but even this wasn't enough. And so, Miller did the only thing he knew what to do. He began to read the Bible for himself, starting in Genesis 1 verse 1 and keeping on going until he found something that could help him make sense of it all. As he read the Bible, Miller became enamored with one part he'd never taken much interest in before, the books of Daniel and Revelation. After the carnage of the War of 1812, Miller had felt convinced that the end of the world and the second coming of Jesus must be just around the corner. The only question was, when? Well, as it turned out, the book of Daniel had the answer, specifically Daniel 8:14. The passage, if you've never read it before, simply says, "Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." Now, if you and I were reading this, we might have skipped over this passage, not really taken much of an interest, but not Miller. He got stuck on Daniel 8:14, and he wanted to know what it was all about. After much study, he became convinced that the sanctuary was the earth, and the purification that the verse mentions represents the return of Jesus and the subsequent destruction by fire that would accompany his coming. Shocked at this discovery and utterly convinced by its implications, Miller knew what he had to do. Which brings us to The Hopeful. Coming this October to a cinema near you, The Hopeful tells the story of William Miller, but it's so much more than that. The film charts a course through history, from the Battle of Plattsburgh to the late 19th century, shedding light on the origins of the Millerite movement, its climactic downfall in 1844, and a group of faithful Christians who picked up the pieces in its aftermath, going on to found a movement that now has more than 22 million members worldwide. In this episode of Science Radio, our editor Jared Stackelroth talks to Kyle Portbury, the director of The Hopeful. It's a rare glimpse into the filmmaking process, as well as an honest reflection on the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. To get more details on The Hopeful, visit thehopefulmovie.com.au. That's thehopefulmovie.com.au. I highly encourage you to see the movie when it comes out this October, but until then, this is Science Radio, episode 208, The Hopeful.
I'm never one that's really ever talked about being Adventist before, like publicly. Like, it's just not a thing that, I'm not the guy. And whilst I respect this, LEs are people I look at and I go, wow, that is an incredibly tough job, particularly in 2024. Yes. Not my spiritual gift, but I respect that it's somebody's, right? But not something that I've ever been comfortable doing. Door knocking, never, just not my thing, right? So what I think is really fascinating is to kind of get an opportunity where you're forced by the fact that you're releasing a film, which is the origin story of Adventism, essentially, in mainstream cinemas in the US. And so therefore the question comes up, what is this film about? And you find yourself suddenly talking about things, even in post-production actually, because you've got, just industry professionals working on it with you. They'll be working on a scene where someone's talking about Sabbath, and then they would ask you about, so tell me more about this Sabbath business, because I work 7 days a week and I'm burned out, and you seem to show up on Monday morning looking quite fresh. Yeah. So there's obviously something to this, like, yes, 1 day off a week business. Like, tell me more. And you're in that position where you're like, I have never, ever in my entire life been asked to explain why Sabbath before. Yeah. So the first time it happened in the Post House in Sydney, these guys were working on The Fall Guy or Elvis or, like Jane Campion's Power of the Dog. And so you're sitting there going, how do I actually articulate to someone who's never engaged with an Adventist before so that I don't come across, or my faith base doesn't come across as weird or kooky? And then I realized actually you just have to be honest about your experience, and then it doesn't come across weird and kooky, right? Like it's just, well, this is my relationship and the way that I do that Sabbath period in my own frame of reference. And then it's really interesting, like the follow-up questions that they have to that, and even just the openness and receptivity to, oh, wow, like, so you have like a 24-hour period of time where it's guilt-free responsibility, like wash out from, oh, wow, like, yeah. Well, that sounds really appealing just on any level, let alone, like, forget the religious aspect of it. That just sounds appealing. And so I think that was really fascinating for me to kind of see the openness where you kind of, I think sometimes, and I think where I put it at is that you're not forcing that conversation onto somebody. Right. You're actually answering a legitimate question that person has in response to their engaging with the story. Yes. Translate that then into people watching it in cinemas in America, and what you're getting is a lot of feedback from Adventists over there going, well, we're having the same experience as well. Like people that went to the cinema with us are asking us questions about our faith that they've never asked. A lot of times it was people that they'd known for 5, 10, 15 years.
Yes.
And they'd kind of friend zoned that faith conversation back when they first got in relationship with that person. And once you get to a certain history of friendship, it's very hard to revisit a foundation set of questions, right? So why do you disappear for to church on Saturday, right? Like that's probably not coming up again if you didn't have it at the beginning. So a lot of people were saying to us, hey, this was a really great way to reintroduce why we do what we do, you know? And I don't know about you, we have cultivated, I think, a really unhealthy sense of we're a peculiar people and we're weird. And we're okay with that, but we would never share that with somebody outside. So
it's almost a badge of honor, right? Sometimes
that we're weird and we're different. Yes. And I don't want to be weird and different. Half of the reason why I approached the story in The Hopeful the way that I did was for the simple reason that I didn't want to sit in a cinema or on a couch next to people I know, the majority of whom aren't Adventist and aren't Christian, and feel uncomfortable with what they were watching and then feel like I was going to be embarrassed about when they turned to me after watching it and be like, really? That's how you see the world? Wow, that's let's not be friends anymore.
Right.
That is not something I wanted to experience. So I approached almost every day in the edit, every decision about how a moment and a character interaction was going to play out with how am I as an Adventist going to feel when someone who isn't Adventist sits down next to me and watches this? Am I going to feel embarrassed by that moment, or am I going to feel like, oh, wow, actually the basis for which I form my decisions in life is actually pretty legit. And it's credible, and actually it's appealing to people that have never engaged with it before. And I think that's been really special actually for me to see the response of people that have never had anything to do, didn't even know Adventism existed before seeing the film. Yes. And just their openness to being like, wow, we had no idea that basically the modern way that we look at health and whole lifestyle choice really finds its roots in this woman's experience from the 1800s.
Yes.
And you've got things like Blue Zones on Netflix at the moment, which has piqued a lot of interest both in the US and also internationally. So I think those conversations are ripe. One really interesting one I had the other day is a guy from New York emailed me, and he's an Adventist. I'd cold called him because somebody had said, oh, you should talk to this guy because he lives in downtown Manhattan. So one of the cinema locations we had was the main AMC cinema in Times Square.
Yes.
AMC 25 Empire, which is a beautiful place to have your film screen.
Yeah.
Unbeknownst to me, he actually went. I didn't know that he was going to go. He went and he said the majority of the people in there, it was basically a full screen for the 2 nights that it played there, were not Adventist and were just cinephiles. So they were people that were tracking the films that were coming out, and they just liked going and watching movies. And he said afterwards, he just went out into the foyer and just started having conversations with people because it's one of those movies that generates an after-film foyer conversation, which again is great.
Yes.
And he said what he discovered were 10 of those people were so engaged with having never heard of this community or these people, and they were like, who is this Ellen White woman? This is she's really fascinating to us, that they all went out and ate afterwards. So he'd never met these people before.
Wow.
They had no idea who Adventists were. 2 weeks later, 2 of them showed up to his church, just unannounced.
Wow.
Based on that conversation that he'd had at dinner. And I think that to me is that encapsulates the opportunity and the value of storytelling, particularly cinematic storytelling, right? Because it affords a relational conversation that you don't have to prompt.
Yep.
It's backtrack to what I was saying before about the discovery that I made about suddenly being asked questions that I've never been asked, and I would never be willing to proffer without, any sense of setup. Like I would never just go, hey, Jared, we just met. Let me tell you about my Adventism.
Let me tell you about the Sabbath.
Let me tell you about Sabbath.
Yes.
There's a great way to not have a relationship with someone really quick, right?
Right.
Because there's no frame of reference for that conversation at all. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think the beauty and the power of the hopeful particularly is that it's the opportunity for that conversation to take place. Mm. Now, we were just talking before, I think one of the interesting things about Adventist culture is that particularly Australian and New Zealand Adventist culture, we're really skeptical and we're really cynical.
Yes.
Particularly about stuff made by Adventists. And for good reason, because a lot of the time we don't make great stuff.
I think it's a general Christian thing as well. We look at films that are put out by Christians.
Yes.
And sometimes they're below par.
Yeah. What I mean by they're not that great is they're not that great at commercial storytelling in the sense so they're great at storytelling which has an outcome that's predetermined, right? Which in the sense, you've got to proselytize because you need...
We don't believe in predeterminism as an Adventist, so...
But we do believe in it from a media standpoint,
we do believe
right?
in
Because
it when we're telling stories for the media, yeah.
What we will do is we will set up a story where we're like, hey, look at this interesting archaeological thing. So this and this and this means exactly this. Can't you see that, right? And if you can see that, here's how you get in touch with us to do, which there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's actually the mission and the role of the church. But when you step that out as the first point of contact for someone that's never heard anything about they're so used to now seeing a documentary, for instance, on Netflix, which presents all sides, every facet of that argument, and just simply goes, hey, what do you think after hearing all of the different answers and all of the different explanations? Which one do you? It's almost like choose your own adventure.
Right.
And societally, and Adventists are no different. We're the same audience as everybody else, right? It's not like...
It's the worldview. It's the prevailing worldview of the Western culture is to ask questions.
Ask questions
and to
let
not
me
necessarily...
figure it out.
Yeah. We don't like, in fact, when people shove answers down our throat. We want to have some critical... We imagine it's critical thinking before we arrive at our predetermined
Yes, our predetermined answer. But we want to feel... like we've got some agency in that storytelling, right? So we want to feel like at the end of whatever we've engaged with, that we can walk out thinking and feeling whatever we want, And I think that that's where when you watch films particularly, if they kind of close that loop for you, there's nothing to really do with it afterwards because you've kind of you've pigeonholed what I can think and feel into just this. So whether or not I want to think and feel anything else, you're not allowing me, I guess, subconsciously to do that. So what's nice about, you go and see something like Oppenheimer, for instance, and at the end of Oppenheimer, you're left, depending on your worldview and the way that you view science and technology and the way that you view human nature, thinking and feeling anything that you feel like, right? Like you can walk, the big takeaway, I don't, it'd be interesting to see what you took away from it, Jared, but like my big takeaway from that is, man, if somebody said to me there's a 0.001% chance that if we press this button, the entire world incinerates, I'm not the guy pressing that button. That's what I realized, right? I realized sitting in there, I'm like, man, alive. Like I'm kind of glad in a way that there are people willing to take those risks, but I'm not one of them. And so I think that that's nice because you get to walk out going, oh, wow, like, so if I'm not that guy, which guy in there am I? And am I the guy that comes off looking great in that, or am I going to be that person who doesn't? Oh, wow. So who am I and what is my thought process when I'm given situations where I have to make life and death choices?
And good storytelling challenges and because we come out with maybe an understanding more of who we are, but at the same time with a challenge to that. And is that what you've tried to do with The Hopeful?
100%.
Would you say?
There's no value in approaching a story, particularly an origin story like The Hopeful, right? Which is about, if you're Adventist, you've heard about these people for a very long time.
Yes.
To the point where they almost have lost their humanity.
Yes.
So what I particularly focused on is, well, who were these actual people, right? Because they're no different to you and I. Just because they existed in the 1800s, the same pressures and real world realities of, so we feel like we have a mission, right? But we also have a family. So that mission is going to interrupt the way that family unit works, right? And that hasn't changed. Like that's been the case for millennia, right? Like a dude in a cave goes out all day to go and forage and hunt for food. Meanwhile, his wife and kids are back in the cave waiting for him to return. And if he doesn't return because he gets killed by whatever thing he's foraging and hunting, they're probably going to die now too.
There's a very real world consequence to that.
Somebody pointed this out to me the other day, right? Like when you see someone like William Miller walking around paying more attention to his Bible and ignoring his family, to what detriment or what value? Who knows, right? So, but he's sacrificing time. And to me, that's a great, just real world human reminder. You know, if I'm putting so much focus and energy into the mission and the things that I want to do and the career aspirations that I have, then I'm forgetting to have that little moment where I cut a window in a cardboard box for my daughter.
Yeah.
Right? And stick my head through and poke my tongue out at her. Like if I'm forgetting that because I'm so focused on this, and it almost doesn't matter what that is, like that can be like really great biblical truth.
The Bible.
Right? But if I'm ignoring the fact that there's a relationship over here, that this is telling me that and I'm not doing, then I'm not really balancing my life or service, and I'm in the same position in 2024 that these guys are in and wrestling with and grappling with in 1824, you know? So, and I think that's a big wake-up call for us, right? Like just because we've gone, these people have this huge canon of goodness that we recognize, and they started a movement that we're all a part of today, doesn't mean they didn't get stuff wrong.
Right.
And getting stuff wrong is totally fine. You know, you hear a lot of like, I guess, detractions about Ellen White. Well, she didn't get everything right.
Right.
And what about this thing that she wrote? And what about that? I'm like, well, welcome to failure.
Welcome to the human experience.
Welcome to the human experience. Like we do not get 100% of everything that we do correct, and neither should we, right? Like people view failure, I think, in 2024 particularly, and maybe it's social media influence, who knows, right? Like plenty of more intelligent people than me have done those studies. But what I can say is that from my experience, if you don't embrace failure and you don't learn to love it, success is never going to happen because you're just not going to try stuff.
Right.
And success, quote unquote, perceived or otherwise, only happens because you failed enough times to learn how to not make that set of mistakes.
Right.
And so you get this perceived success. But that's going to come with a whole bunch of other mistakes that you didn't realize that you were inadvertently making that are going to lead to a whole bunch of other failures. But then you're going to have this success over here, particularly in the context of something like 1844, right?
Yes.
We have looked at that and we, in fact, call it the Great Disappointment.
Yes.
Which, when you actually think about what it did, it reframed what exactly Miller's focused message was, which when you go back to what he really focused on and preached about and what Ellen gravitated to and everybody else gravitated to, it's this unique character of Christ that is wholly different to what he was hearing in the pulpit at the time.
Yes.
So what he was hearing in the pulpit at the time is God or Christ or the Holy Spirit is vengeful, judgmental. You should be afraid of anything that you're doing bad because it's judgment time. You know, what Miller discovers, in his own words, is he found a friend in Jesus.
Yeah.
And in finding that friend, he then got into studying who that person and their character was, and then he found a prophecy that he thought pointed to something. And he was wrong. Okay, big deal, right? Like people are wrong about stuff all the time.
Yep.
But when you have a look about what that wrong misstep, that failure of understanding actually led to, you look at the fruits of it and you're like, well, that's the positivity of that movement down in this era is the largest Protestant healthcare network on the planet, for example,
right,
which has done untold amounts of good for untold amounts of people across the planet. You've got organizations like ADRA, which are in 120 something countries, not 120,000. That's all the other dimensions and all the other multiversal.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm with you.
You get what I'm saying. But those, when you have a look at that, you go, they would not exist today without that failure.
Wow.
Right? So that success is built off the back of learning and failing, success. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what can we learn from that? Oh, okay, so let's do this now. Mm-hmm. And, failure. Oh, now a little success over here. And so I think if we embraced more the value of that failure in our origin story and we realize that that's actually okay to get stuff wrong because at least you did something.
Right.
And at least you tried.
Right.
And in doing and trying, you will then move on to the next thing. And you'll move forward instead of just stagnating and being too afraid to try anything and do anything else. Mm-hmm. That to me is the big encouragement again for us, like as Adventists, go and try what it's like to sit in a cinema with a group of people that have no idea who you are and what you believe other than you're in a cinema with them. And then see what conversations happen afterwards. Take the people in your world who aren't Adventist. And if you don't have non-Adventists in your world, my encouragement to you would be to go and find some relationships that are non-Adventist.
Get out of the bubble.
Get out of the bubble and actually go, okay, so my life and my context, if I can shed a little bit of hope and healing, which is that unique Christ character that Miller discovered and then passed on to all of these other people and have extrapolated out down to 2024 as a movement of, 22 million people globally who at our core, we are simply a people who view the character of Christ as being hopeful and healing as the forefront, right? Like that's kind of our take out to the world.
Yes.
Why would we ever be embarrassed or ashamed about that? That's a pretty positive thing to go out to in relationship and in conversation with. All the other stuff, probably doesn't matter as much. That matters, I think, more than any policies or any, any other established.
Right.
That simple truth that those handful of people really locked into and engaged with in the mid-1800s through a failure, right? And that should be a beautiful message to all of us. I tell my kids all the time when they come home and they're really bummed out about not doing well on a spelling test. I'm like, well, you'll never get those words wrong again now, will you? The value of that is that, who actually cares about the grade in reality, right? That's just a metric that's made up for whatever reason because we have to assess. And we've got to give you something in your school report at the end of the day. But the value for you is actually, okay, so that's affected me in a way now. So I'm going to look at that word and I'm never going to get that word wrong again, right? Or you're going to go, I failed. I don't like failure. I'm never trying. So I'm just giving up now from this point, So it's that I think to me speaks to the power of cinema more than anything because you then, go back to what we're saying about Oppenheimer and our relationship to characters. So when you sit in the hopeful, I think we all like to go, we would be the hero in this story.
Right.
I sit in the hopeful and I go, I'm actually probably more likely going to be the person who's ridiculing the heroes on the street. And I'm probably going to be Ellen's sister, Elizabeth, who's like, I'm probably one of the people that's fallen off the path and I'm done with prayer groups in reality. So if we're provoked by that story and we're honest about where our kind of leaning is going to be, if we recognize ourselves in a character who isn't the most appealing, quote unquote, from a pious religious point of view,
yes,
the value of that's really massive actually, because you go, well, why would my default be ridicule of someone who's giving it a shot? Is it because I'm afraid of looking stupid and I'm afraid, maybe I don't like fail, And so I think what it does is it helps you to process who you are and what your natural response is. And then what am I going to do to combat that? How am I going to work against that if that's not the person I want to be?
Yeah.
So if I've recognized I'm leaning into that, cynicism, and because it's much more, it's easier to be cynical than it is to be passionate.
Right.
You know, like cynicism is it's the lowest common denominator there is. Like I can rip you off, you know, any day of the week. It's a very low burn energy-wise. But for me to get passionate about something and to go, no, this is what this looks like, and I'm going to hang my hat on this, and I'm going to be passionate, and I'm going to be the advocate for this. Man, you better be ready for some slings and arrows, right? Because all the easier thing to do is to chuck a barb at somebody.
Speaking of barbs, critical reception. How has the movie been received? You mentioned that it is stimulating conversation, but in terms of the actual scope, how did it do in America? It's been released there. We're still waiting for it in Australia.
Yes, so coming in August.
We're coming soon, you know. But what's the reception been like, and some of the critical reaction, and also the reaction of those who have seen the movie?
Actually, fantastic, which has been great to see. Like if you go onto Rotten Tomatoes and have a look at our audience score, we're at 93% audience score rating, and most of those responses, from what I can tell, aren't Adventists. It's just people that go and watch movies and like to comment, because that's the whole point. And the way that Rotten Tomato works, you can't game that system.
Right.
You know, they will pick that. Their algorithm's good enough to pick that gaming, and then they'll readjust it on you. So what's been really, I think, pleasantly surprising is that story, because it's a human story with real-world universal value. You know, we all persevere, we all anticipate something, we're all disappointed from time to time, and we all have to make a decision about how we're going to deal with that disappointment moving forward. Those real, recognizable, relatable characters, I think, are having audiences come out going, oh, wow, this is actually just, first and foremost, a great story with great characters. But also I'm gaining an insight. One of the most fascinating things to me is people going and researching this period of time or these people after the fact, and then coming back onto social media and go, oh, wow, I just discovered this about, and like there's this huge hospital down the road that both my kids were born at, and I had no idea it was an Adventist hospital, even though it's got Advent Health written on it. You know, so I think it's been fascinating to see what the general public in America have done, which is it's really dispelled, I think, some big misconceptions about, you know, if you didn't know Adventists existed, well, now you do. And now you're recognizing their existence in your community, which you didn't recognize before. You just knew that was a hospital.
Right.
But now you know it's got this basis and this historical underpinning to it. The other one is most people we found, particularly in our non-denominational research, think that Adventism is either an offshoot of Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness. And so just simply being able to clearly differentiate what those three denominations actually are, and they're very unique and very separate to each other. And you Adventists are obviously not derived from either of those. Is a great identity opportunity, right? And the feedback we've gotten from a lot of Adventist audience that went there is, oh, wow, it's like, it's really fascinating to have taken people who thought they knew who I was and have realized they didn't at all. And the conversations that sprang out of that for them have been really, it's re-inspired them to feel proud of their heritage in a way that they hadn't before. And we've gotten a lot of that, emails and phone calls about that, which is pretty cool, because that's, in the end of the day, I think what I always set out to do was give our origin story an angle that hadn't previously been done. You know, it's a story from the perspective of this guy, right?
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about why you made the movie. You've said that it's changed the way you can now have conversations. You've been able to have conversations, but when this was still an idea, why you and why this movie? Like, where did it come from for you? Why did you want to tell this story?
Well, I think, I shot Tell the World for the church. So that was a, 6-part mini-series that went into a lot of depth and detail. And it's fantastic. A lot of people really loved it, and it did a lot of great stuff internally from a church perspective. I think what I always saw, because The Hopeful was filmed at the same time, so it existed and has sat there for, I guess, the best part of the last 10 years. I looked at that and I went, wow, there's a different way of approaching this story. So it's like if Tell the World takes it from this angle, what would happen if you came around this side of it and you focused on a different set of characters, and the characters even that are the same, that same actor, same character in Tell the World and Hopeful. But what if I looked at them from over here instead of looking at them from over here? And I went, actually, there's a really great story sitting in there, and what a shame it would be for it not to come out because of this reason, because there is this unhealthy shame about who we are and almost a skepticism about an organization telling stories, right, that we talked about. So again, there's nothing bad with an organization storytelling.
Right.
It's just it's going to be very different to an individual storytelling, and I guess I was pretty fortunate that there were a few people at different levels of the organization that controlled that IP that kind of heard me out and were like, okay, we see what you want to do here, right? Like it's a very different approach to this story, and it's a personal approach. It's like it's Kyle, the storytelling professional, wanting to dig into the sinewy fiber of storytelling and character in a way that was never possible in Tell the World.
Right.
So I think what it allowed, when there's one person whose vision is this is how I want to express, I guess, my curiosity about who these people were and why they did what they did. That's a very different thing to a committee of people going, well, we shouldn't allow this because that.
Right.
Like we can't have characters arguing with each other because what does that, right. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's a, what do you call it? It's a safe way of approaching, right? Because you have to play it safe at that level.
Yes.
I don't have to play it safe. That's the fabulous thing about being this guy, right? Like I can be like, well, actually people argue and it's okay to see them argue. It's okay to see Ellen and James with a baby and the baby crying and them causing more distress by the argument that they're having. Because guess what? I've had those situations before.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens with real people. Just because you are a prophet of God doesn't mean you don't argue with your husband or wife.
Yeah.
Just because you feel called to something doesn't mean that you don't make mistakes and get stuff wrong. I think it's really healthy for people to see that too. Like it doesn't, what's the word for it? Not downplay, but it doesn't take away from the fact that you can still have that experience and still have that drive and that desire and still stuff up and get stuff wrong.
Yes.
Regularly, all the time.
Yep. The human experience.
The human experience. I think the encouragement to all of us should be, wow, well, if in their just regular humanity, they can still have this amazing spiritual experience that can have this legacy. Well, imagine what I could do even in my own tiny little sphere of influence, right? With that mindset and mentality. So I think what it afforded me, because they, like that opportunity was, I advocated for it and was able to get there and tell that story in that way. I think what you get is a much more personal take. And that's why I said, like, it's now one person artistically going, let's get curious and explore the human elements of this story and how do relationships function in this big narrative, right? So it's honing it down and going, well, what's the real world reality to the people? Rather than, oh, look at this big movement and all the stuff that it's done. It's really like laser focusing it down onto the actual human experience within that.
As a theme, hope.
Yes.
Right? Why do we need hope in the world today? It's a loaded. I could answer the question from like looking around the world. There's things going on. People are struggling. But from your perspective, this theme of hope. Why is it so important to tell this story now?
I think the people, I'm going to look down the camera for this, because the person on the other side watching this conversation doesn't need me to tell them that, right? they're smart enough to work that out. And I think that's the value of storytelling for cinema, is that you're acknowledging that audience, you guys, are really intelligent. So you're going to go and you're going to have an experience with the hopeful, and you already know why the world needs hope. You don't need me to sit here and pontificate about it. Like, it's very clear to us, and I think what engaging with stories that provoke and prompt you to think about who you are in the world and why our particular as Adventists worldview is very hopeful and healing in that hope, and the role that you play when you walk out of the cinema re-inspired, that taking that hope and healing out into your little area of the community might actually be a really good thing for the community.
Well, what does hope mean to you then?
I think if you are genuine about wanting to have a relationship with another person, right? Like you're actually not, you've moved from it being transactional, like I'm going out and I'm having this conversation or this relationship so I can get this thing back and I can go and tell somebody, oh, look at the numbers.
Right.
Whether it be box office or whatever it be, or even baptisms, dare I say, right?
Yeah.
If you move it from transactional and you move it back into relational, and the most important thing about that is that the person that I'm in relationship understands that I care about them. And understands that if they say, hey, Kyle, I need to tell you this in confidence, or I need a hand with this thing, right? Or can I rely on you for X, Y, Z? That's not going to come with the, yes, you can, but first of all, read this handbill and come to church with me.
Right.
I think that's where, to me, hope lies. It's in that the relationship is more important than the transaction. And when you see the response that people give when you genuinely are interested in them and their life over what you're going to get out of that relationship, there I think lies the hope and healing. So hope to me is relationship first. Get to know people, become part of their life. That's the most important thing that you can do, because if you're part of their life, then you're simply being there is going to bring a hope that didn't currently exist. Unless you're a very negative person and not very nice to be around, in which case you're probably not going to do that. But you're not that person. You're a very kind,
thank you, Kyle.
Caring person. I meant that in just general politics. About the person out there. Yeah.
America is a very Christian nation.
Yes.
In some ways. It's slated that way. People are a bit more comfortable or a bit more familiar with that Christian identity. Yeah. Australia and New Zealand, not so much. We're sort of very post-Christian, secular societies. Yep. How do you think that will impact the way the movie's received here?
Well, I think that depends on how you perceive storytelling, right? Like if you're going to the hopeful expecting to be dictated to, then the impact's going to be negative, right?
Right.
And my encouragement to people is go and see it and see for yourself what it is first. Like go out and engage with it. Don't end game what you think it is, right? Like somebody said to me the other day, well, isn't this just Tell the World repackaged? No, actually it's not. It's a very, very different story. And it's all well and good for me to say that, right? But you're not going to know that unless you go and watch it. So if you think you know what you're going into, my encouragement to you is, well, go and watch it and prove that. And if it isn't what you think it's going to be, well, that's going to be great too, isn't it, right? And also the other encouragement would be, even if you saw Tell the World, the whole purpose of The Hopeful is to create a cinema experience that gives you the opportunity to engage with the community who never saw that in the first place anyway. Right? That's just not something that they ever engaged with. It was never designed for cinema. That was not its purpose. And so now having this unique opportunity of a cinematic experience, which by the way is going to be mainstream released in Australia and New Zealand, it's going to be on screens for at least a week, right?
Yeah.
Multiple sessions a day in multiple cinemas all around both countries. So, I mean, it's not, it's going to be a very different experience, and there's going to be a lot of visibility in both Australia and New Zealand. What a golden opportunity to, again, go back to the beginning of this conversation where I was talking about being asked about aspects of my faith that shocked me because I've never been asked about my faith ever before. You know, like that's going to be interesting for people, suddenly realizing that there is an interest in some of these things that we thought people would have no interest in, you know. I think getting that mindset shift and that change of, oh, wow, okay, so this thing that I do that I always thought was weird and quirky is actually appealing to somebody else who's never heard of it. Oh, okay. Especially if you're a lifelong Adventist, right? Like this is an easier equation I found talking to people that discovered Adventism later in life or became Christian later in life, right?
Yep.
Like it's easier to see how that transition happens. For someone like me who's been a lifelong Adventist, well, you never arrived at a come to Jesus moment, right? You were born into it. And so suddenly being confronted with, oh, like this is actually appealing to people outside of like my immediate family traditional upbringing. Okay. Interesting. And in these areas that I never thought would be interesting at all. You know?
So if I am an Adventist, which I am,
which you
surprise, what do I do with the film? How do I engage with it? What's the best way to engage with this film?
Well, I would say go and buy a ticket when it goes on sale, like you would, you know, you go to the cinema and watch Oppenheimer, so go and buy a ticket like you normally would there. And then after you watch it, who are the 3, 4, 5 people from your sphere of influence who you think would benefit from coming back and going to see the movie with you, and then take them out to eat afterwards? You know, it's also one of the very few films that are going to be on general cinema release this year in Australia and New Zealand that's actually truly a family movie. You know, we had, you know, I would walk into cinemas in America and there would be everyone from the age of 5 to 95 plus in there together. And they all had a fabulous experience, but totally different.
Right.
So when you would talk to the 5, 6, 7-year-old kid or the 13-year-old or the 18-year-old or the 85-year-old or the 40-year-old, everyone's experience was slightly different. The things that they talked about were different, but they had all enjoyed it collectively.
Right.
And that's quite a unique thing in cinema today. Like there's very few, like I couldn't take my 11-year-old son to Oppenheimer.
Right.
You know? So I can only enjoy that film by myself, essentially. You know, I can't take my kids to that. Whereas I can take my kids to The Hopeful and they're getting something completely different actually to what I do out of it. You know, my kids hadn't seen it for a year and they went to the premiere in Los Angeles a couple of weeks back. And it was interesting because my daughter was like, I don't remember like enjoying it quite this much, Daddy. And I'm like, well, that's very like candid of you.
Yep.
Because that means that the first time she watched it a year ago, she remembers not enjoying it as much as she enjoyed it a year later. You know, and so you kind of go, oh, wow, like that's not her pandying to like, oh, this is my dad's film and he made it. This is her actually discerning for herself. And when I asked her what it was, she said, oh, I really liked Lucy Miller and I liked the way that she encouraged him. I liked the way that she spoke to him. And I also liked Ellen because of the way that she persevered. And so you're like, wow, I never anticipated that my 9-year-old would engage with a film that was never designed for her in the first place. Go figure. You know?
So take the family, take your friends, make a whole day of it, make an event.
Yeah, and don't, you know, like travel together.
Yeah.
Because again, it's about relationship, right? It's about getting in community. It's an opportunity. So it's going to be weird for the guy that made the film to say this isn't actually an opportunity to see a movie. It's an opportunity to hang out with people, right? That's the opportunity. And I think that's the more important thing than the film. The film is just the excuse. The actual opportunity and the value to you is the experience that you're going to have with the people that you take. So don't just go by yourself. You know, that would be my encouragement. Yeah.
Which character would you say you identified with and who was the hardest to portray in the movie? Because as you've said, some of these people have been built up in a sense, as often happens in religious traditions. You know, people become almost canonized.
Yes.
So which one did you find yourself relating to and which one was hard to actually portray for whatever reason?
Yeah. Well, I think it's fascinating that those two are both women for a start, right? So I relate more to Ellen's sister Elizabeth, just in attitude, right? Like I see in her a cynicism and a natural sense of skeptical that I hold, right? And so I look at her response to these events and I go, it's probably a good thing that I wasn't in existence in this period of time, because if I'd gone through that experience, I think I'd be her, where I'd be like, yeah, this is bogus, you know? And I think it's healthy to recognize that. Like, it's easy to go, oh, yes, I would be the person that stuck with it, persevered to the end and, you know, praise Jesus. I wouldn't be.
Right,
you know?
right.
And I like the fact that I can be honest with myself about that. And I think the flip side of that, Ellen, hugely hard character to do justice to as an actual human being, because she's been mythologized to the point now where she's almost irrelevant, you know? So it was trying to work out how to give her an actual life back again based on hard fact and reality. So like a lot of the work I did originally, it was great because it's all sitting there in rushes to work with. But I had to reacquaint myself even in the edit. At nighttime, I would go home and I'd reread correspondence just to double check. And I looked at the correspondence between her and her husband, or her and Bates, or her and whoever it was, right? These guys wrote lots of letters and they're all available to look at freely online, which is great. So you can work out who someone is by the way that they speak to other people. And so I would constantly double check that and go, oh, okay, so yeah, it is legitimate to say that this person in this situation would respond like this. Okay, so as I'm sitting down in the edit suite and I'm looking at crafting that particular performance in that scene or that moment or that sequence, okay, I've got a really solid basis to go, I'm going to craft it in this direction, because that's what I think is the closest to the person that I'm seeing in the written correspondence.
Right.
You know?
Yes.
And so you're always trying to give them life, you know? And for me, an audience member sitting there, you know, she's hard to give life to because we've almost sucked the life out of her.
Right.
We have put on her either she can do no wrong or all she does is wrong.
Right.
You know, so there's these two polar camps now when it comes to Ellen White in Adventism. What's fascinating when you talk to people who've never heard of her before and encounter her for the first time in the Hopeful, they're like, wow, there was a woman in the 1800s with agency who got listened to by men and her legacy is this?
Yes.
This woman's amazing.
Right.
You know, and so to see that response to it, you're like, man, we have really done this person a disservice historically as Adventists, because we have either made her so like heavenly minded that she's no earthly good, or we've just gone, everything that she said and did was rubbish.
Yep.
So let's just chuck it out and don't look at it at all. I think the answer to relating to her and her role in modern day Adventism is somewhere in the middle of that, right? Like, and choose your own adventure with her, right? Like, where is she useful to you? You know, like she said herself many times, and I love that she did this, that she went, I am not the last word and testament on anything. You know, I'm just giving you a lesser light, which is a term she used often. I'm just giving you an insight, essentially, is what she's saying. Take it or leave it, you know. But don't make the mistake, and I think people in 2024 make the mistake of reading something that she said to someone in the 1800s as gospel truth, right? Without looking at the context of the fact that she went specifically to that person, right?
Right.
And it was a message for that person.
Yes.
So whatever you believe about her inspiration and what she said, don't read into her saying something to someone specifically as a word for you. Like, if you can get something interesting out of that, great, good for you. Like, if that provokes thought and it challenges you, but that is not a mandate on your life. That was a mandate on that person's life if they chose to buy into it, you know? And so I think it's looking at her in the context for which she established for herself, you know, first and foremost. And then the value is in the person and the fruits of that person's life. And again, I come back to the fact that what she gravitated to was a very clear hope and healing character of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at her legacy down the line, say what you will about her, but there are a lot of good hospitals that do a lot of good in the world, and there is a massive humanitarian agency that does a lot of good out in the world. Now, if that's not hope and healing and a legacy to go, okay, well, there might be some value to her, right? Then, I'm open to being wrong about that.
Why would a non-Christian person want to go see this film? It's about a Christian church, the start of some obscure to some people denomination that they haven't heard of before.
Yeah.
Why would they want to spend money? It's expensive in Australia to go see
It's expensive
a film.
everywhere to go and watch a movie.
Why would they do that?
Because it's good characters and a good story, right? You don't have to be Adventist to enjoy a good story about good characters, right? All biopics function on, well, here's people and something they did that there's recognizable and relatable things in their character and the way that they respond to the world. And that's interesting, right? Like, it's interesting seeing how somebody else dealt with a big life change. That's why we go to the cinema. We want to see how other people dealt with things. And then we want to experience the emotional roller coaster that they went on in the safety of a cinema seat with popcorn.
Living vicariously through those
through
characters.
Yep. So whilst you don't have to be like looking forward to the soon return of Christ, you can be looking forward to the new car that you're potentially going to buy with the windfall that you're going to get from XYZ, right? And when that doesn't happen, you're going to be like, oh, yeah, I recognize like that ugly crying in the field, right? Like, because that's what I did when that thing didn't pan out the way I thought that it. Oh, and look at how they dealt with that. So I think it's in seeing how other people deal with the big issues and the big life experiences. The context is almost irrelevant, right? So for someone who doesn't have anything to do with Christianity or Adventism, it's no different to going and watching Oppenheimer, for instance. You're just getting an insight into someone's life that you didn't know about, And I think that's the interest. And people love period drama.
Yep.
A good costume drama with a great, and honestly, like the music in this, Blake Robinson, who did the score, and Jonas Myron. So if you've ever listened to 10,000 Reasons or Cornerstone, he wrote both of those with Matt Redman. More recently, he's been working a lot with Andrea Bocelli.
Wow.
So a lot of Andrea Bocelli's most recent single releases have been written by Jonas. He just wrote an album for Matteo, Andrea's son. He's been working with Lauren Daigle and Barbara Streisand and Celine Dion. So just, and those songs are out now, actually. You can go, if you go to Spotify and just type in the Hopeful Movie soundtrack, it's already out. It got released with the US release back in April. And Made For You, one of the 2 title tracks, songs, is already out as well. So you can listen to both those. They're amazing. Absolutely world-class storytelling in their own, right, on their own. So you'll get a real sense of time and place from Made For You, for instance. Like you'll listen to that and you'll go, oh wow, this is speaking to me in a way just as a song. Like it's an incredible journey and experience in the 3.5 minutes of the song. So go and check that out. It's on all the places you would find music now. And
the kids love it.
Oh, kids love it.
Yeah.
And they had engaged with. I guess the value of your father being a filmmaker is that you get to meet random people all the time. So when we were doing post production in Sydney in 2022, they came down and they got to see things in the middle of creation.
Right. That process part of the process. Yes,
so they got to engage with Jonas and got to know him. And so they'd already listened to a lot of his back catalogue. So it was interesting. So they'd already been listening to a lot of his songs. So they're just tracking now. He's like part of their playlist promotion.
Right, wow.
Yeah.
As a director, how has this changed you? Making this movie, the story, the characters, and your outlook on life going forward.
Yeah.
How is this process?
Well, I think it's fun creatively when you look at something you made 10 years ago for me now, right?
Yeah.
Like, so coming at that with fresh eyes was actually a lot of fun because you realize you're like, oh, well, we got really great performances in the camera. And 10 years down the track, you're more mature creatively. You've just had a lot more creative experiences in your life. But also just the way, like, you're 10 years older. So your life experience and the way that you look at the world is different. So I looked then at those characters and those story beats and the way that story could play out with a very different eye to how I would have 10 years ago. So it was a lot of fun because, like, this film could not have been made any time before we walked into the Post house down in Sydney in August of 2020. So 2 years ago, almost. I didn't have the maturity to tell it this way back then. I also didn't have the industry connections, right? Because you've done more stuff.
Right.
You've now all of a sudden, Jonas and I only met on a previous, I was working in South Africa on Angel Studios' David movie that's coming out next year.
Oh, great, yeah.
As one of the lead writers on that. So if you've seen there's 5 prequel shorts, young
Seen
David.
some of the shorts, the kids.
So I wrote those with Brent, the director, as well, back a year and a bit ago.
Yep.
So Jonas and I met on that film. Yep. And so it's great because you realise that, okay, this other creative collaborator has a very similar way of looking at, rhythm and timing and how music functions in a story narrative. And so we got to play around with ways that music and dialogue and visual interact that I never would have ever even tried 10 years ago because I would have been too afraid to. Again, it comes back to this failure thing. Like, I've got really comfortable now with stuff not working out.
Right.
So it allowed me in this process to just try stuff. And a lot of times it works.
Yep.
And stuff that doesn't, you just go, oh, well,
try something else.
Try something else. So, and I think when, maturity also allows you to be like, well, this person and their skills aren't a threat. When you're younger, like, almost you view the world as like, well, if this person looks better than I do, then what's that going to say about me, right?
Okay.
Like, you get down the road a little bit and you're kind of like, actually, I'm pretty lucky to be getting to work with these incredible people and they make many more films a year than I do. So I'm kind of silly if I don't. Let's look at the options that they've got and how they're looking at this story and the prompts that they give. And then you go, okay, maybe that piece and maybe this bit. Oh, and I really like that offer. That's a great offer. Let's try that in the mix. And then all of a sudden something changes and you go down a completely different path than any of you would have gone down before.
Yep.
And you've got this beautiful film at the end of it that's not like anything you imagined that it could have been, And I think that's been the learning for me is you have to be fearless to tell stories without, just let the story tell itself through you. Don't try and force it into a corner because you're too afraid to let it tell you where it needs to go. I think that was the discovery for me is that it's, the more you kind of let it breathe, I don't even mean in time, just like kind of let that process guide you as to how that story should be told. Where is it resonating with people? The majority, there was only 2 Adventists that ever worked on the post-production of this.
Yes.
And so it's nice because you're getting constant feedback from people who are just looking at films in general.
Yes.
Like massive movies. Like a colorist did Elvis before he did The Hopeful. So, yes. And straight after that, he was working on like George Miller movies, Most of our post team did Furiosa. Like 2 weeks after our final mix, they rolled onto the premix of Furiosa. So you kind of, they're looking at things critically from a storytelling point of view. And when they're saying, this is a really good movie, Kyle. Like we're really enjoying this. This is this is kind of like what our expectation is of cinema. You're like, okay.
Great. Yeah.
You realize it's an Adventist story, right? That's fun because you're able to go, okay, well, our stories are on par, right? Like they're as engaging to a general audience as anybody else's story. So why not tell them?
Hey, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure, Jared.
Yeah, it's been lovely to hear a bit of the background behind the story. Is there anything else you'd like to share to wrap up this conversation?
No, just buy lots of popcorn because, There's no better way to enjoy a movie, really, than popcorn.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. Just as a reminder, if you'd like to find out more about The Hopeful, all you need to do is go to thehopefulmovie.com.au. That's thehopefulmovie.com.au. There you'll be able to find a cinema near you so that you can go and see the movie when it comes out this October. By the way, if you've been enjoying Science Radio, please consider leaving us a rating and a review on the podcasting app of your choice. It really helps us out, and it's totally free. Apart from that, if you'd like to read more about The Hopeful and so much more, visit sciencemag.com. That's SIGNSMAG.com. You'll be able to find a written version of this interview on sciencemag.com, as well as a movie review by our very own Zanita Fletcher, as well as all of our other excellent content. There you'll be able to also find links to our Facebook, Instagram, and contact information if you'd like to send us an email. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.